This is the NPIP, National Poultry Improvement Plan School on video. This is due to the COVID-19 impacts on social gatherings and social distance practicing and the protection of public health. So I'll remove this mask for our presentation and then we move into the rest of the program. My name is Randolph Chick. I'm the state veterinarian for Arkansas. I have been since fall of 2018. Again, what we're trying to do is to reproduce the opportunity to present a NPIP, or National Poultry Improvement Plan program. And this is the blood testing schools that are offered generally in 2 or 3 locations around the state of Arkansas. And this year we will not be able to do that because of the restrictions on gathering and congregations. So we're trying to make this possible by your remote access to the instructional videos, but I want to give you a little rundown on what we're going to be doing. For new applicants, please contact the Arkansas NPIP office. You can do so by calling 501-823-1717 and leave a voicemail if necessary with the information, your name, address, contact phone number, and also an email would be very handy. Any renewal notices that will be sent out to past applicants will be sent to the most recent address on file with the NPIP. Those that will be required to test, and those folks typically are people that either are newly taking the exam, have a 1-year anniversary coming up, they have to be retested, or a 2-year, and those will be, that information and materials will be sent to the addresses we have on file. Any renewals for 5 years or greater will be sent a statement for the amount owed. So instruction and testing procedures, the written test will be mailed to the address provided via the voicemail or to the address on file from our past registrations. You need to access the instructional video on the Livestock and Poultry page of the ADA website, ADA being Arkansas Department of Agriculture. You can find that at www.agriculture.arkansas.gov, or perhaps through your search engine by putting in Department of Agriculture, Arkansas. Please then, on the home page, tap in the white bar across the top, the Livestock and Poultry section. That should take you to our Livestock and Poultry face page. Touch on the icon button for Poultry Health and NPIP programs, and look about mid-page of that presentation for the blood testing school information. If you do not have an internet access, paper copies can be made available to you by request. Again, you'll have to contact us and relay that information to us so we can get it to you. After completing the test, please mail back to the NPIP with correct fees to the Arkansas Department of Agriculture, National Poultry Improvement Plan Office, 1 Natural Resources Drive in Little Rock, Arkansas, 72205. NP tester cards will be mailed to you after the successful completion of testing. Today our presentations will be via video, and these online instructional programs will be consisting of 5 parts. The NPIP history and functions will be presented by myself, Randolph Chick, Arkansas State Veterinarian. Our second presentation will be NPIP Biosecurity. This is a difficult subject to present and really difficult to teach. So if you would, please pay special attention to the slides that are presented to you. Andrea Andrews, who is the Arkansas NPIP coordinator, will be making this presentation. Other presenters will also comment on biosecurity in their presentations. Following Ms. Andrews' presentation, Poultry PT Blood Testing School will be presented by Dr. Terry Conger. Dr. Conger is the area epidemiologist for the U.S.A. APHIS VS, that's United States Department of Agriculture, Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, Veterinary Services Division. After Dr. Conger, Dr. Dustin Clark, who is the Extension Poultry Veterinarian with the University of Arkansas, will discuss poultry diseases associated with the NPIP program. These are the program diseases that we monitor and test for, over and above the Porum typhoid. The last is an instructional video. This was developed for the Porum typhoid testing, and Charity Barber, who is a youth program manager for the University of Arkansas Extension Service, is going to demonstrate some blood collection procedures, that for lab submissions and also for testing on plates. Also, she'll demonstrate a wing stick and toe clip methods for collecting those blood samples. So with that, I'd like to move into the history presentation. Again, this is Randolph Chick, State Veterinarian for Arkansas. And what I want to do now is go over some of the NPIP history and functions of the NPIP program. Again, these are in preparation for the blood tester schools for 2020, and this is due to the COVID-19 impacts on gatherings and congregations of folks. Again, I'll state that we normally would hold this in 2 or 3 locations around the state and have opportunities for people to attend live presentations and ask questions. Unfortunately, this year we won't be afforded that opportunity. Again, NPIP is a National Poultry Improvement Program, and it's a cooperative federal, state, and industry program that was established in the 1930s. Help coordinate programs for the elimination of pullorum disease, and that disease is also known as bacillary white diarrhea, or BWD, and that is caused by a bacterium, Salmonella pullorum. A gentleman by the name of Leo Retger in 1899, roughly 120 years ago, determined the cause of pullorum disease, but it took another 15 years or so for a test to be developed by Dr. Jones in Wisconsin. Considered the greatest single factor that limited that poultry industry at that point in time, the disease caused nearly 80% mortality in young birds. Pullorum is transmitted in one manner from a hen to her chicks via the egg. A number of states started statewide programs in the early 20s, and a few breeder flocks were being identified as free of pullorum. The start of the present-day program became operational in 1935, and at that time was named the National Poultry Improvement Plan, and subsequently was adopted by 47 states. Nevada was the one holdout at that point. Today, that program is still called the National Poultry Improvement Plan, and certain adaptations have been made in the program over the last 85 years. The National Turkey Improvement Plan, which is now part of the National Poultry Improvement Plan, or NPIP, was established in September of 1943. In December of '71, the 2 plans were combined, and the provisions were applicable to the different types of poultry. Nevada became part of the plan also in 1994, and this program became responsible for the blood sampling and testing for classifications of various disease control programs for over 3 billion breeding chickens and 250 million turkeys during the first 70 years. Now the program is about 85 years old, and those numbers have increased, of course. Same name, same mission, disease suppression is the same purpose and intent and part of the mission. Part of what drove the present program in its form is the establishment of the Meat and Poultry Inspection Act in 1957. It was a forerunner of the FSIS, or Food Safety Inspection System, that now operates to assure the food safety of the meat and poultry supply for the United States. MG was found to be egg transmitted. MG is an acronym for Mycoplasma gallisepticum. And again, egg transmitted like pullorum disease, so they plugged that straight into the program. And that was done in 1965 and then added for turkeys in 1966. MG is also referred to as chronic respiratory disease syndrome, or PPLO, which is plural pneumonia-like organisms in turkeys. Mycoplasma synovia, a cause of infectious synovitis in turkeys and chickens, was also found to be egg transmitted shortly thereafter and was added as a planned disease about 10 years afterward. In 1983, Mycoplasma malleagratus was added to the NPIP program for turkey breeder flocks. Similar symptoms caused respiratory problems in turkeys. In 1980s, Salmonella enteritidis arose as a human health problem and considerable challenge in certain regions of this country. Salmonella, again, is often egg transmitted, so this SC program, as we refer to it, was added to NPIP in 1989. Development of the global marketplace in the 1990s led to greater exports of poultry genetic stock and also poultry meat. Trading partners wanted that assurance that products that were originated from flocks that were free of avian influenza. So the program U.S. Avian Influenza Clean was established for breeding chickens in 1998. 2004, which was the anniversary of the 37th anniversary of the biennial conferences of the NPIP, commercial poultry were added. In this category were the table egg layers, broilers, and meat turkeys. They all became part of the National Poultry Improvement Plan, or NPIP. At the same conference, the NPIP approved an H5, H7 low-path avian influenza monitor classification for those categories, table egg layers, broilers, and meat turkeys. This is a cooperative program between the federal government, state governments, and the industry. So it is a voluntary testing and certification program, generally fee-based, for producers of poultry breeding flocks, those that produce hatched chicks and poults, hatching eggs, and then the hatchery operators and dealers. Poultry can be defined for the purposes of the NPIP as domesticated chickens, turkeys, ostriches, emus and rays, cassowaries, waterfowl, and game birds. Doves and pigeons are not part of the NPIP program. When they're bred, these birds are bred primarily to produce eggs and meat, so they are domesticated. Another purpose of the NPIP is to provide support for any new technologies that come up for establishing standards and evaluation of testing of poultry for respect to certain diseases. So test kits, new methods for, say, PCR techniques, that sort of thing, are also usually reviewed at these biennial conferences. Diseases of concern to NPIP programs, and Dr. Clark in his presentation will go over this in greater detail, are avian influenza, also called fowl plague, porm or porm disease, escalinarum, fowl typhoid. Well, that's part of the PT complex, the diseases of which our blood testers are certified to test for in the field. Salmonella enteritica variation enteritidis, which is SE in the vernacular. Mycoplasma gallisepticum, also called MG, and as I noted earlier, CRD, or chronic respiratory disease. MS, which is Mycoplasma synovia, infectious synovitis, and then Mycoplasma malleagratus. The NPIP has programs for U.S. salmonella monitored and U.S. sanitation monitored, designed to reduce the incidence of salmonella in hatching eggs, chicks, and poults through the effective sanitation procedures that can be applied to both breeder farm, in the hatchery, and elsewhere in the poultry production system. Again, Dr. Clark will cover this in some of his presentation. I'd also like to note that the NPIP program is supported by a system of approved labs located at various locations in the state of Arkansas. Some are private and some provide services for a fee. The Arkansas Diagnostic Labs are located in Little Rock and in Fayetteville. Customarily, they provide services to the poultry and other animal species patrons of those labs, but we also provide services in terms of analysis of any porm typhoid reactors that should be detected and are required to be submitted to the diagnostic labs. 3 groups of participants are involved in the NPIP program: independent flocks, hatchery operations, and in dealers. All these are engaged in production and sale of live poultry and also hatching eggs that are produced for various customers. The vast majority of U.S. states prohibit the entry of any poultry shipments except those that are designated as porm, typhoid, or PT-free. Essentially, those bans mean that poultry cannot move interstate unless they have met all the requirements of the NPIP, U.S. Porm Typhoid Clean Program. And again, being tested negative for porm typhoid before leaving the state of origin. 15 states also require that all imports of turkeys be MG clean. That requirement for turkeys moving interstate requires participation in the U.S. MG Clean program and be tested free of MG before shipment. Most trading partners importing live poultry and processed products from the U.S. require an NPIP participation. Each spring, APHIS publishes an updated directory of participants handling A-type and meat-type chickens and turkeys, and the directories of those participants that also handle waterfowl, exhibition poultry, game birds, and radites. These directories list the hatcheries, the independent flock producers, and the dealers that participate in the program, the products they handle, and the disease programs that they participate in for testing. For further information about the program, that can be obtained from www.poultryimprovement.org, and you see the address on the screen in front of you. Again, an additional address would be NPIP. This is the national office located in Conyers, Georgia, again on the screen. Contacts for the state of Arkansas would be Andrea Andrews, the NPIP coordinator, and myself, Randolph Chick, state veterinarian.
I'm Andrea Andrews, the NPIP coordinator for the state of Arkansas with the Arkansas Agriculture Department. Today we're going to talk about NPIP biosecurity. Biosecurity, by definition, are the procedures intended to protect humans or animals against disease or harmful biological agents. There are 14 points to biosecurity. 1. Biosecurity coordinator, training, line of separation, perimeter buffer areas, personnel, wild bird, insects, and rodents, equipment and vehicles, mortality disposal, manure and litter, replacement poultry, water supplies, feed and replacement litter, and reporting of elevated morbidity and mortality, and auditing. The biosecurity coordinator, they're responsible for a couple of different things. They're responsible for the development, maintenance, and continuing effectiveness of the biosecurity program. Their responsibility could be at the farm, production site, or complex, or the company level. They should be knowledgeable in the principles of biosecurity, and along with the personnel and caretakers are responsible for the implementation of the biosecurity program. They should review the biosecurity program at least once per year and make revisions as necessary. The training section involves the training of people involved in biosecurity. This should include any training materials that cover both farm and site-specific procedures, as well as premises-wide and company-wide procedures as appropriate. All poultry owners and caretakers that regularly enter the perimeter buffer area must complete this training. This must be done and documented at least once per calendar year. New poultry caretakers should be trained at hire, and training records should be retained as stated in the Title IX CFR, which is available on the NPIP database online. Number 3 is the line of separation. It's the functional line separating the poultry house and the poultry inside from exposure to potential diseases. This is defined by the walls of the poultry building to account for entry points, structural aspects, and outside access areas. The site-specific biosecurity plan should describe and/or illustrate the boundaries of the line of separation and clearly outline the procedures to be followed when caretakers, visitors, or suppliers cross it. For poultry enclosed in outdoor pens, similar principles for the line of separation can be applied for defining and controlling the line of separation for each separate pen. The perimeter buffer area is a functional zone surrounding the poultry houses and raising area that separates them from areas unrelated to poultry production on the site. This also applies to adjoining properties. It is comprised of the poultry houses, raising areas, as well as the nearby structures and high traffic areas involved in the daily function of the poultry farm. This would include, but not be limited to, things such as feed bins, manure sheds, composting areas, egg rooms, generators, pump rooms, etc. The site-specific biosecurity plan should describe and/or illustrate the boundaries of the perimeter buffer area and clearly outline the procedures that caretakers, visitors, or suppliers must follow when entering and leaving the PBA. Point 5, personnel. The biosecurity program and/or the site-specific biosecurity plan should include provisions specifically addressing procedures in biosecurity PPE, personal protective equipment, for site-dedicated personnel. The plan should address the procedures in biosecurity PPE for non-farm personnel. The plan should also specify procedures which all personnel having had recent contact with other poultry or avian species should follow before re-entering the PBA. Number 6, wild birds, rodents, and insects. Poultry operations should have control measures to prevent contact with and protect poultry from wild birds and their feces, their feathers as appropriate to the production system. These procedures should be further reviewed during periods of heightened risk of disease transmission. Control programs for rodents, insects, and other animals should be in place and documented. Number 7, equipment and vehicles. The biosecurity plan should include provisions for procedures for cleaning, disinfection, or restriction of sharing of equipment where applicable for the site. Vehicle access and traffic patterns should be detailed in the site-specific biosecurity plan. Mortality disposal. Deceased poultry should be collected daily, stored, and disposed in a manner that does not attract wild birds, rodents, insects, or other animals, and minimizes the potential for cross-contamination from other facilities or between premises. It is recommended that deceased poultry disposal should be on-site if possible. Mortality disposal should be described in the site-specific biosecurity plan. Manure and litter management. Manure and spent litter should be removed, stored, and disposed of in a manner to prevent exposure of susceptible poultry to disease agents. On-site litter and manure management should limit attraction of wild birds, rodents, insects, and other animals. Replacement poultry. There are 2 points to replacement poultry that should be kept in mind. They should be sourced from a health-monitored flock that is in compliance with NPIP guidelines. They should be transported in equipment and vehicles that are regularly cleaned, disinfected, and inspected. Biosecurity protocols should be in place for equipment and personnel involved in the transport of replacement poultry. Number 11, water supplies. It is recommended that drinking water and/or water used for evaporative cooling should be sourced from a contained supply such as a well or municipal system. If drinking water comes from a surface water source, water treatment must be used to reduce the risk of disease-causing agents. If not possible, a risk analysis should be performed to determine actions needed to minimize risk. If surfaces have been cleaned or flushed with surface water, subsequent disinfection should be utilized to prevent disease transmission. Number 12, feed and replacement litter. Feed ingredients, bedding, and litter should be delivered, stored, and maintained in a manner that limits exposure to contamination risks posed by wild birds, rodents, insects, and other animals. Feed spills within the PBA, the perimeter buffer area, outside the line of separation, should be cleaned up and disposed of in a timely and complete fashion. Number 13, reporting of elevated morbidity and mortality. Elevation in morbidity and/or mortality above expected levels as defined by the Biosecurity Plan should be reported as required in the site-specific Biosecurity Plan. Appropriate actions should be taken to rule out reportable disease agents. The last point is auditing. Auditing of the biosecurity principles is based on flock sizes outlined in the 9 CFR and the NPIP database online. Audits shall be conducted at least once every 2 years or enough times during that period by the official state agency of Arkansas to ensure that the participant is complying. For the sake of time, I'll let you read the rest of this on your own. The last slide that you'll have available with your test booklet is kind of just a shortened version of this PowerPoint. It's the NPIP 14 Biosecurity Principles slide. So all these 14 principles will be kind of shortened for you to look at more clearly, shorter points, less detailed, but it's just a good reference.
Hello, I'm Dr. Terry Conger. I'm with the U.S.A. APHIS Veterinary Services. I work with a team in Arkansas promoting the NPIP program. I'm certainly gratified to be here with you to discuss the NPIP Pulorium typhoid testing program with you all. My role in this presentation is to give you an overview of the importance of disease surveillance and also talk about 2 or 3 of the most important diseases that we should be looking for. I'm the poultry health specialist in what we call the Field Ops District 4, which includes 8 states, but I'm stationed up in northwestern Arkansas, residing in Pea Ridge, Arkansas, because most of my work is in southwestern Missouri, Arkansas, and northeastern Oklahoma, where the bulk of the poultry processing plants and poultry broiler producers are located. So let's get started with what we're talking about. So today I'm going to give you an overview of the importance of the poultry industry in Arkansas, and also, like I said before, the reasons for poultry disease surveillance, and give you an overview of 2 foreign animal diseases. One of them, the first one of optimum importance is virulent Newcastle disease, and then give you an overview of avian influenza. And I want to talk about biosecurity, which is the key to preventing infectious diseases in poultry, and emphasize the role of your role as PT testers when you're out there testing chickens. So if we look at the map of the United States, you look at Arkansas, the dark red shaded areas are the areas of highly concentrated commercial poultry facilities. And as you can see, the Mississippi River Delta in eastern Arkansas does not have any shaded areas, because that's more or less row crop area, rice, soybeans and whatnot. But you can see in north central and western Arkansas is a highly concentrated area of poultry and egg producers. If we look at the U.S. per capita consumption of meat, in the 1970s, in Arkansas, the cow-calf industry was number one in terms of beef production. But with the advance of time, over time, poultry, chicken, particularly broilers and meat turkeys, are consumed more and more regularly. So in the U.S. per capita consumption of meat, if we compare chicken or broilers, beef, and pork, chicken, is preferred by the American consumer much more than consumption of beef and pork. If we look at the retail price range for beef, pork, and broilers, you can see that beef is on a per pound cost basis. A pound of beef is probably two-thirds or three times that of a pound of broiler meat, and pork falls right in the middle between those two. So that's another reason that broilers, chickens, turkeys are preferred over beef and pork because of the cost at the grocery store. If we look at the poultry industry in Arkansas, depending on the year, Arkansas rates among the top 3 states in broiler production in the nation, producing over between 970 million pounds broilers per year to 1 billion broilers per year, which amounts to 6 to 7 billion pounds per year at a value of between $3 and $4 billion per year. So you can see how important the poultry industry is as a contributor to the economy of Arkansas. Arkansas also ranks, depending on the year, either 3rd or 4th in turkey production, meat turkey production. We produce over 30 million turkeys a year, amounting to over 600 million pounds per year, with a value of over $450 million per year. And we rank, depending on the year again, between 10th to 12th in the United States for table egg production, amounting to over 3 billion table eggs per year, amounting to over $480 million per year. When we talk to the agricultural industry, there are almost 6,000 poultry farms in Arkansas, of which the poultry industry comprises almost 42,000 jobs. There are 42 broiler complexes in the state that process about 30 million broilers per week. There's a new complex in the northeastern part of the state, in which is cranking up. So that is the broiler production is becoming more and more prominent across the state generally. It comprises about $1.25 billion in wages, $3.5 billion in cash receipts, and the chicken industry comprises over 3/4 of all agriculture cash receipts, and 1 in 4 agricultural jobs in Arkansas is involved with the poultry industry, whether it be contract growers or processing plant workers or veterinarians and such. If we look at the pie chart here, you can see that 44.3% of all commodities in Arkansas are poultry and poultry products. So across the board, the poultry industry is the #1 commodity if we talk about broilers, meat turkeys, and table egg production, surpassing that of oil, cotton, and row crops such as cotton, corn, wheat, and rice. Cattle and calves, cattle and calves or beef is about #6 in terms of profitable commodities in Arkansas. The reason for poultry disease surveillance: poultry can carry a number of diseases that affect poultry, but we have to remember that chickens, turkeys, broilers also carry a number of diseases which humans are susceptible to. So those diseases are referred to as zoonotic diseases. Zoonotic diseases occupy about 66% of all infectious diseases of humans. By definition, a zoonotic disease is a disease carried by animals which are transmissible to humans. And the third reason for poultry disease surveillance is the economic impact, both for interstate commerce between our neighboring states, and international commerce. So once again, you can see how important poultry disease surveillance is in the United States, as well as in Arkansas. So if we look at some of the diseases that are carried by chickens that are transmissible to humans, some strains of avian influenza are transmissible to humans. The most important zoonotic disease carried by poultry are Salmonella species. That's a bacterium, which Salmonella is in the United States, there are between 1 and 1.4 million cases of Salmonella infection disclosed per year, of which a higher percentage of those are carried by live poultry, which are transmissible to humans. As you can see, there are a number of other viruses and bacterial diseases carried by birds, poultry, in particular poultry, that are transmissible to humans. If we look at, in terms of disease surveillance, you as pulmonary typhoid testers play an integral role in terms of surveillance for poultry diseases, because you are out there on the front lines, whether you're commercial testers that are testing in commercial grower facilities, or if you're private testers testing backyard flocks, you are on the front lines and you are more likely to observe chickens that may be diseased that need to be reported. So you can see there are a number of agencies involved with this disease surveillance program. The Arkansas Department of Agriculture, of which the Arkansas Livestock and Poultry Commission plays a prominent role. The University of Arkansas Cooperative Extension Service, which also plays a role. The Arkansas Department of Health is also interested in poultry disease surveillance, because, like I say, a number of diseases carried by poultry are transmissible to and infectious to humans. If we look at some of the clinical signs that you can observe, you see there are upper respiratory signs where we see oral discharge, swollen sinuses, difficulty in breathing, neurological signs, and also blanching or bleeding in the shanks and swollen paws, as you see in some of these slides here. You will be testing for Salmonella typhus, but you should be aware of signs of reportable diseases. of which are two important foreign animal diseases. A foreign animal disease is one that is not presently within the United States. So once an incursion of one of these diseases, whether it be poultry, cattle, swine, horses, whatnot, they must be diagnosed and eradicated as soon as possible to prevent further spread of the disease and to support commerce, whether it be interstate or international commerce. There are other important, economically important reportable diseases that have clinical signs that are very, very similar, if not identical, to those signs exhibited by avian influenza and exotic Newcastle disease, which are the two important foreign animal diseases that are potentially carried by poultry. The mycoplasma diseases, and also another important disease that is reportable is infectious laryngotracheitis. All of these diseases cannot be diagnosed by clinical examination. A laboratory specimens must be collected and a laboratory diagnosis must be made because clinically they all are very, very similar. So let's talk about Newcastle disease, otherwise known as virulent Newcastle disease. It's caused by a virus of the family Paramyxoviridae. There are 9 different serotypes, but avian paramyxovirus 1 is the one disease that we're concerned with that causes virulent Newcastle disease or exotic Newcastle disease. There are several different pathogenic strains of Newcastle disease, and this particular chart here, there are three strains that we should be aware of are lentogenic, mesogenic, and velogenic. Lentogenic Newcastle disease is very prominent, especially in backyard flocks, as opposed to velogenic or virulent Newcastle disease, which is the foreign animal disease strain of this particular disease. The velogenic Newcastle disease is the most serious poultry disease in the world in that it is so prominent in other parts of the world and affected flocks. There's 95 to 100% death loss or mortality shortly after a flock is infected. Velogenic Newcastle disease causes immediate shutdown in commerce. In other words, other countries do not want to import exposed or infected poultry or poultry products, so they shut down the trade with an infected zone or country. The OIE, Office of International Epizootic, has a definition of poultry, and the reason I bring this up is we'll go over a little bit later. We've had an incursion of virulent Newcastle disease in Southern California recently, and that did not count against our trade until it got into commercial flocks. Exhibition or backyard flocks or chickens raised for shows, races, or exhibition purposes, or poultry fights or cockfights, which is prohibited in the United States, but it still goes on underground. Backyard poultry fighting flocks are officially classified by OIE as exhibition flocks, so it does not count against us in terms of prompting trade embargoes. Trade embargo only results when it gets into commercial flocks. So if we look at the ways in which exotic Newcastle disease may enter the United States, they can enter the United States through smuggled fighting cocks. The exotic Newcastle disease in 2002 and 2003 in Southern California. The source of that infection was reputed to be an imported or smuggled fighting rooster out of Tijuana, Mexico. Or they can, exotic Newcastle disease is also carried by exposed citizen birds. Citizens are parrots. The exotic Newcastle disease in Southern California that occurred in the years from 1971 to 74, the source of that particular infection was an exposed or smuggled in parrot. Then another way in which Newcastle disease can enter the United States is exposed migratory waterfowl, particularly double-crested cormorants and northern pigtail dabbling ducks. Avian influenza, the reservoir, prominent reservoir and reason for transmission of avian influenza to poultry is a wide variety of migratory waterfowl. So if we look at ways in which exotic Newcastle disease is transmitted, either through direct exposure to an infected chicken or bird, then after a flock becomes infected, that germ, that virus can be transmitted via trafficking of humans, fomites, from one farm to the other, or even by service people. So once a flock becomes infected, contaminated equipment, feed trucks and whatnot going from one place to another can transmit that virus from one place to another. In terms of when it comes to exotic Newcastle disease, the morbidity, meaning the number of birds that are affected in a flock, is up to 100%. Mortality is over 90%, and it varies greatly depending on the virulence and strain and avian species affected. Some species show little or no clinical signs, but they still can transmit the disease. If we look at some of the clinical signs exhibited by affected Newcastle disease, we have swollen sinuses of the head, edema of the head, which is fluid gathering in the head, especially around the eyes, greenish, dark, watery diarrhea, or respiratory or neurological signs, and these signs vary with species and the virulence of the particular strain. So this slide here shows you signs of, there's a duck in the bottom left quadrant there that is displaying neurological problems, torticollis, and the chicken just above that also is exhibiting extreme wry neck or torticollis, and the most prominent sign is that exhibited in the slide on the right there, a chicken showing respiratory signs, nasal discharge and whatnot. Exotic Newcastle disease is also infectious for humans, but it causes a very pronounced conjunctivitis. This is a close-up of a person with infectious conjunctivitis caused by the exotic Newcastle disease virus, where we see the eye there is very bloodshot there. It is limited, though, to the upper respiratory tract, and there's no mortality involved in humans with exotic Newcastle disease. If we look at the history of exotic Newcastle disease or virulent Newcastle disease, it first entered the United States in chickens imported from Hong Kong in 1950. And like I mentioned before, the exotic Newcastle disease outbreak in 71 to 74 was in Southern California, which resulted in two and a half years before the disease was eradicated, 12 million birds were affected, had to be depopulated or succumb to the disease. And back then it cost $56 million to eradicate the disease, which is transmitted to 10 times that much in today's price scale. And the disease in 2002, 2003, like I mentioned before, primarily in Southern California, but it spread into Southern Nevada and western Arizona because of movement of birds. There were 4 million birds that were affected. The eradication costs were well over $200 million in today's vernacular. Trade restrictions amounted to almost $300 million back then, which would mount up to $500 million in today's cost range. If we look at the areas that were affected in that particular outbreak, we see Southern California primarily, San Bernardino County, Los Angeles County, Riverside County, and then in southern Nevada there and western Arizona. And the reason for the transmission into Arizona and Nevada is by movement of exposed birds into those areas. Also coincident in that outbreak was one affected flock which was disclosed in just east of El Paso, Texas, in which one backyard fighting flock owner noticed a high mortality in his flock, so he contacted a veterinarian and got help immediately, and it did not spread beyond that single flock in Texas at that time. So that's the reason for a rapid diagnosis and response to incursion of the disease. In the 2018 to 20 outbreak in Southern California, same area as the previous two outbreaks in Southern California, primarily Riverside, Los Angeles County, San Bernardino County. It took 2 years from the initial diagnosis to the final eradication, which was declared on June 1st of 2020. If we look at the areas affected, we see once again Los Angeles, Ventura, Riverside counties, and San Bernardino counties were affected. Same counties that were affected, same demographic, primarily backyard exhibition birds, exhibition in terms of fighting cocks were affected. We see it Northern California, and in Alameda County, there was one affected flock disclosed, which was caused by movement of exposed birds up into that county. And then we see Utah County in central Utah, one affected flock there, and then one in Cocomino County in Arizona, which was once again caused by movement of exposed birds out of the primary affected area. So if you look at the production types, the backyard exhibition birds are fighting roosters. There were a total of 498 affected premises were disclosed in the 2018 to 2020 outbreak, of which 476 were backyard fighting roosters. There were backyard non-commercial turkeys, backyard non-commercial poultries. There were two live bird market sales, 4 retail feed stores, 1 retail pet store, and also even a veterinary clinic was affected with an infected flock. So you can see it's widely spread, but the primarily affected area, flocks in that area were backyard exhibition birds, which primarily are owned by Hispanic folks. If we look at the affected counties in that particular outbreak, the most highly infected county was Riverside County, number 2 was San Bernardino County, and number 3 was Los Angeles County, which is almost identical to the affected counties in the previous 2 outbreaks in Southern California. We had one affected premise in Ventura County, but that was an outlier in which that was a boarding facility for exhibition birds, or what we call a training facility for fighting cocks. There were 27 owners involved with that one premise because it was where they took their birds to train as fighting roosters. So that was an outlier. The one affected area in Alameda County was just one. It was a treatment facility for sick birds, and one of those birds happened to be affected by virulent Newcastle disease. If we look at the management style, this particular slide shows you a typical backyard fighting cock rooster, fighting cock facility in which roosters are tethered to shelter there, and they're scattered throughout the backyard there. So that's an interesting management style, and you all probably seen that similar facilities in Arkansas because they exist. Here's an overview of some of the affected areas. In Riverside and San Bernardino County, even Los Angeles County, it's not really in a rural area, it's in a suburban area, and that particular facility right in the center there, you can see there are several small pens for backyard exhibition birds. The next slide is, we're going to talk about, give you an overview of avian influenza virus. Once again, it's a virus disease of the family Orthomyxoviridae. There are three main serotypes. Type A, which all species of birds are susceptible to avian influenza type A viruses, plus several other species. The type E influenza viruses are those strains affect humans. Those are seasonal influenza viruses affecting humans only. Then type C influenza viruses can affect both humans and swine. If we look at how influenza A viruses are subdivided, they're subdivided on the basis of the antigen types on the surface of the virus particle. There are 16 different hemagglutinin antigen types and 9 different neuraminidase antigen groups. Each avian influenza virus has both neuraminidase and hemagglutinin antigens on its surface. So if you count up the 16 hemagglutinin antigens and the 9 neuraminidase antigens, there are 144 different possible combinations. There's extreme antigenic variability and also difference in virulence depending on the particular strain. So we look at the outside surface of the avian influenza virus. You can see the spikes on the surface of the virus. There are hemagglutinins and neuraminases. H5 and H7, in other words, hemagglutinin 5 and hemagglutinin 7 serological strains, causes the most severe diseases in humans, and there are a number that are also affect humans. If we look at avian influenza viruses that are classified in 3 pathogenic groups, there's highly pathogenic avian influenza, HPAI, which are mainly H5 and H7 strains, but can also be any strain of influenza A viruses, depending on if it's high mortality, they can be classified as a highly pathogenic avian influenza virus, or HPAI. There are LPAI, or low pathogenic avian influenza strains, which are now only H5 and H7s, but they're not causing a high mortality. It's only when they mutate and cause a a high mortality where they're reclassified as a HPAI or highly pathogenic avian influenza strain. Then all other influenza A viruses have low pathogenicity, are in a separate class. Only the first two groups are high path AI and low path AI, H5H7. The reason for H5H7 in low path AI, they have a tendency to mutate to the high path AI strain. If you look at the possible routes of entry of low path AI and high path AI into the United States, we see that the primary mode of transmission are exposed migratory waterfowl, ducks and geese, or we can have imported or smuggled imported birds, or the mutation of a low path AI into a high path AI strain. In every case, there's a breach in biosecurity, whether it be a backyard flock or a commercial broiler house or meat turkey facility. If we look at the clinical signs, as you remember, the signs that are exhibited by virulent Newcastle disease and also mycoplasma, like I mentioned before, or infectious laryngotracheitis. All of those signs are very, very similar. For that reason, a laboratory diagnosis must be made. So a flock that is exhibiting any of these signs must be reported, where a foreign animal disease diagnostician can go out and collect signs, collect diagnostic specimens where they can be diagnosed in the laboratory. In Arkansas, certain strains of mycoplasma are of high prevalence in the state, and those flocks must be tested to make sure, be certain that it's not actually avian influenza or virulent Newcastle disease. So that's why a laboratory diagnosis is so necessary. The most significant clinical sign of high path AI is high mortality. Within 3 or 4 days after the first spike in mortality, there's virtually chances of close to 100% mortality in a commercial flock, especially older turkeys, which are more susceptible to avian influenza than broiler houses. If we look at the transmission routes, the primary route of entry, as you can see, it's a spillover from migratory waterfowl. Poultry, turkeys, or chickens are exposed either through direct exposure to migratory waterfowl carrying the virus, or through indirect exposure through migratory waterfowl, tracking in fecal material on the boots or whatever into a commercial flock or into a backyard flock facility. Once it gets into a flock, it can be spread by human transmission, what I call human transmission, affected service workers going from one commercial flock to another, or through contaminated boots or equipment moving from one place to another. If we look at them, as I said, migratory waterfowl flyways. In the wintertime, ducks and geese migrate south, as you know. In the summertime, they migrate north to their breeding grounds in Canada or in Alaska. If we look at the United States there are 4 prominent migratory flyways. The Pacific Flyway, which courses down the Pacific coast. Then the Central Flyway courses down right over Arkansas and Oklahoma and Missouri. The Mississippi Flyway kind of follows the course of the Mississippi River, and the Atlantic Flyway down the Atlantic coast. But the key feature here on this diagram is there is interaction and interchange up there over the Bering Straits with the ducks and geese in Asia, in China, Vietnam, South Korea. Those areas have a high prevalence of highly pathogenic avian influenza, and waterfowl that are exposed there can interact with migratory waterfowl in the western hemisphere up there in Alaska over the Bering Straits, and there can be exchange of that virus, and that's what happened in 2014 and 15 outbreak. In the 2015 outbreak of the particular strain H5N2, that was an outbreak of historic proportions. It is the most severe incursion of a foreign animal disease in the history of the United States. There were 21 states affected. There were 232 premises positive for high path AI, 211 of which were commercial, and 21 backyard flocks. Almost 50 million commercial poultry were affected, which mounted up to almost $1 billion spent by the USDA in response to that outbreak before it was eradicated. If we go to the next slide, we can see the number of states there that were affected. The most severely affected state up there was Minnesota. Minnesota is the #1 meat turkey producing state in the nation, and the next most severe affected state was Iowa. Iowa is the #1 table egg producing state in America. So that's why in 2015 at the grocery store we saw the cost of a dozen eggs go up, and that was due to the avian influenza outbreak in 2015. Missouri had 3 affected flocks. One of them was a backyard flock in northeastern Missouri, right close to the Illinois border, and there was 1 commercial turkey flock affected in Manitou County in central Missouri, and another commercial turkey flock affected in Jasper County, southwestern Missouri. The 1 affected flock in Arkansas was in Boone County, north central Arkansas. If we look at this particular slide, this is what we call an epidemiological chart, in which it displays the number of affected flocks on a per week basis. Over there on the far left, the first affected flock on the far left, the color code is red. That was a captive wild flock. It was a raptor rehabilitation flock right on the Washington, British Columbia border, in which they were feeding the birds that were trying to rehabilitate hunter-killed ducks, and the raptors, particularly falcons, were dropping over dead because falcons are very susceptible. So that was the first affected flock in January in the United States of 2015. Then we had several backyard flocks in Washington State and Oregon. And then we had moved into Southern California in a couple of weeks, in which we had 2 commercial flocks in California and some backyard flocks affected. Then we moved along. We thought it was over then. The incursion was over. We move on into March there. And first week of March, the first commercial turkey flock was disclosed in Minnesota, and almost simultaneously the 2 commercial turkey flocks in Missouri were disclosed, and the one in Boone County was disclosed. But the take-home message from this particular chart here is that you can see how rapidly it spread once it got in the commercial turkeys, or commercial operations. It spread like wildfire by movement of contaminated equipment or people or feed trucks or whatnot. It spread like wildfire there. And finally, it was curtailed in, the disease started in January and was curtailed. The last affected flock was disclosed in June of that year, 2015. So that was an overview of the outbreak in 2015, but we had one high path AI affected flock disclosed in 2016, and that was in Du Bois County, Indiana, which is one county north of the Kentucky border. That strain was H7N8. As you remember, H5 and H7 strains are most prominently high path AI. So we had a total of 8 flocks in one 10-kilometer control zone, 8 commercial turkey flocks disclosed, but only one of them mutated to high path AI. All the others remained low path AI. So we had H7 and 8. In terms of how it spread, it was once again movement of contaminated equipment, from one place to another, or contaminated personnel moving one place to another. So how did it start? It is theorized that there were H7N8, that particular strain was diagnosed in migratory waterfowl in that particular area. It was theorized that a duck hunter went duck hunting and brought back the virus, either contaminated clothing, and introduced that H7N8 strain into a commercial turkey flock, and it spread from there. And then in 2017, we had a total of 2 high path AI flocks, all in the same control area in Tennessee disclosed. And this particular strain, once again, was H7N9. Once again, carried by migratory waterfowl, but we had 2 instances in which it mutated into high path AI. And it spread to a total of 6 different states were involved. But in terms of the H7N9 high path strain, 4 states were involved, all in the Tennessee, Kentucky, Georgia area. And we had 6 flocks in Alabama affected too. So the summary of the most recent outbreak this year in March, H7N3, we had 11 H7N3 low path AI commercial turkey flocks disclosed in North Carolina, and 9 of which were under the same management. But there were, a week or so later, 2 affected commercial flocks were disclosed in South Carolina. All of these were low path AI, but we had in one house, in a flock on a facility in South Carolina, one house was disclosed with H7N3 high path AI. In other words, it mutated from a low path AI strain to a high path AI strain. And once again, the source was migratory waterfowl carrying that particular virus. So the key, how do we prevent incursion of any of these diseases into either backyard flock or into a commercial flock? Biosecurity is the primary and most important tool to prevent disease incursions. So you all must observe proper biosecurity measures when you go out and test a backyard flock. So the perpetuation of the poultry industry depends once again on persistent and accurate disease surveillance, persistence, prevention, rapid response, and control. As PT testers, you all are a part of the surveillance team. So in conclusion, as pylorium typhoid testers, in addition to performing the PT test according to protocol, you must promote biosecurity wherever you go. You are involved in disease surveillance, and if you identify a flock that is displaying non-specific upper respiratory signs especially, or neurological signs, you should report it to the state veterinarian's office or the federal veterinarian's office, so proper diagnostic specimens can be collected and a definitive diagnosis can be made in a laboratory. That's my contact information. Like I say, I'm the poultry health specialist for the Field Ops District 4, and it's been my pleasure to visit with you about your important role as PT testers in disease surveillance control. Thank you.
Welcome to the NPIP Blood Testing School. I'm Dr. Dustin Clark. I'm the Extension Poultry Health Veterinarian for the University of Arkansas Division of Agriculture. I will be talking to you today about some of the diseases that are part of, that we test with the National Poultry Improvement Plan, some of the diseases that have been for the reason for starting the schools and starting the whole NPIP program, and a little bit on some other information for you. So bear with me and we'll get started. Okay, one of the first things that you will be doing as private testers or commercial testers that we depend on you to be part of is our first line of defense. And we would like for each of you to learn to recognize the signs of illness in poultry, recognizing that a lot of the diseases look alike, but we refer to a bird that's looking like this as ADR. Now that's a term that we use in veterinary medicine, and that stands for ain't doing right. As you can tell, this bird here on the left is all huddled up. This one here on the right for sure ain't doing right. In fact, it is dead. Give you an idea on some of the physiology of the bird. Chickens have a body temperature ranging from 102 to 107 degrees Fahrenheit. Their heart rate is fairly high. Average size chicken is about 200 to 250 beats per minute, and their respiration ranges from 15 to 30. Lots of signs of disease in the avian species, and you can see these here on the screen. There's depression, a discharge from the eye, the nose, or the mouth, diarrhea, coughing, sneezing, inability to stand or walk, loss of feathers. You may see scabs on or around the leg scales. Of course, no appetite. Changes in the feathers such as loss or broken or accumulation. You may find parasites on the bird or sometimes in the feces of the bird, such as when we see tapeworms. Swollen joints, blisters or scabs on the skin, a swelling of the foot pads, and then swelling of the face, comb, or the wattles. When you first get to test these birds, we're depending on you to just give them a quick once-over, basically a very quick physical examination. Just systematically go through and check all the anatomic systems for variance from normal, looking at things such as discharges or accumulation or use. Can they use both of their legs or their wings? Abnormal sounds, odors or colors, swellings, swelling of the feathers, or feather loss. And this will give you a rough idea of these systems here, such as the skeletal system, respiratory, plumage, circulatory, eyes, ears, nostrils, gastrointestinal, and in the feces. Now, a little bit on some of the diseases associated with the National Poultry Improvement Plan. The first diseases placed in this program, well, Salmonella pylorium. Now, this was one of the main reasons for the development of the NPIP program, and this disease was referred to as bacillary white diarrhea, or simply BWD. It was later recognized as a salmonella, and it then later as Salmonella pylorium. Now, pretty much this is a disease that we consider a historical disease. We don't see much of it anymore. Back in the early days of the program, it was very rampant and widespread. We do occasionally see this in some of the backyard hobby flocks. Now, it is an egg-transmitted salmonella, and it is adapted to poultry. Mortality is usually seen in the young chicks that are less than 2 months of age. Here we have some depictions. We've got some baby chicks here. You can see they have pasting of the vents with a whitish diarrhea there. It's very rare in the commercial poultry industry. It can infect multiple species of birds, such as quail, chickens, guinea fowl, turkeys. Usually the number of affected birds are young, and it's usually quite low, 10 to 12%. But it can be up to 100%, and mortality can reach 100%. Historically, at the beginning of the NPIP program, the chicks that were affected was running about 80% mortality. In addition to this salmonella being egg transmitted, it can also be spread via an infected navel or through oral transmission where they're acquiring this from the feces. The signs, of course, we have, as we see in the depiction of these birds here, they're depressed, they're unthrifty, they will chirp and huddle, they'll have this white diarrhea and pasty vents. We may have a mild to moderate respiratory sign, they may be blind, and they may be lame. Lesions in some of the birds, typically inside, if we're going to see some of those lesions, there'll be grayish white spots on the organs such as the heart, the lungs, the ventriculus, which is the gizzard, or the liver. We may see these cheesy type cores in the ceca. The birds are going to be dehydrated, may have an enlarged spleen and a congested liver, may have inflammation around the heart, which is referred to as pericarditis, and in adult hens, we may see what's called blighted ova. And here's a depiction where we see this dark discoloration of the ova here on the ovary. Diagnosis pretty much is by isolation of the bacteria and then the blood test, agglutination, which is what's being used that you're using in the field called the rapid whole blood agglutination test, where you'll take a single drop of blood, mix it with a single drop of the antigen, and see if it clots together. Treatment, the disease is treatable. It's used, typically we use antibiotics. Some of the older treatment were some of the things such as sulfas and tetracyclines, but it's not a good idea to treat it because of resistance to that. In fact, treatment is just really hardly ever done anymore. What we do is prevention, and a big part of that prevention is the rapid whole blood testing that you will be doing. We test breeder birds, we remove those that are positives, and then good biosecurity. All the biosecurity principles and protocols that you have been exposed to in this school, those are all good to help prevent this disease and others. And we do widespread testing. This is one of the reasons for testing for it, to make sure we don't have the problem creeping back into the commercial industry or into the backyard hobby flogs. Another salmonella that was part of the beginning of this program is Salmonella gallinarum. Now, this is the T of the PT test. The Salmonella pyllorum is the P, and this is the T. In fact, it's based on the old name of this disease, which is called fowl typhoid. And this was another reason for the formation of the National Poultry Improvement Plan. It is a salmonella, basically Salmonella gallinarum, which is also adapted to poultry. Very, very similar disease to what we see with Salmonella pyllorum. Rarely see this one in the industry as well. Occasionally see this one in hobby flogs. Can be seen in chickens and turkeys and game birds, very similar to pyllorum. Number of affected birds can be up to 100% sick or 100% dead. Usually it's much, much lower than that. It too is an egg transmitted salmonella. And we also have horizontal transmission with what we call fomites, where it can be tracked around in infected feces and things like that. Signs, again, very similar to what's seen with pyllorum. They're going to be unthrifty, they're not going to want to eat, they'll have lack of appetite. In adult birds, decreased egg production. They may sit around ruffled up and have a yellowish diarrhea. Most of the time when we see fowl typhoid, we see it in older birds, very commonly in adult birds in comparison to the young birds. But again, this is a very rare disease. Lesions, one of the hallmark lesions is an enlarged bronze-colored liver, like we see in this slide here. Having an enlarged spleen can be some anemia and an inflammation of the intestinal tract, which is referred to as enteritis. Diagnosis, again, very similar to pyllorum. The rapid whole blood agglutination test is what's used, and then isolation of the bacteria. Treatment, antibiotics, but that's not done routinely. In fact, it's very seldom done anymore. We rely upon prevention, isolation and testing of the breeder birds, basically euthanasia of any of those that test positive, and then biosecurity, possibility of some vaccines for some of the other salmonellas. Okay, the next round of disease additions to the National Poultry Improvement Plan. Remember, pyllorum and typhoid were the first two that brought about the formation of the National Poultry Improvement Plan, but other diseases were placed into this program for control. And those are the mycoplasmas. Now, mycoplasma are very small bacteria that are fairly unique. They lack a cell wall. Now, that is important because many of the antibiotics that we use are used and they work against the cell wall formation of the bacteria. Mycoplasma don't have a cell wall. These bacteria can also be egg transmitted, and they can be transmitted what we refer to as horizontally by fomites, such as they can be in your hair, on your shoes, things like that. These tend to be more of a chronic type of infection. Now, Mycoplasma gallisepticum we refer to as MG, commonly called CRD by many of the backyard hobby producers, and that stands for chronic respiratory disease or chronic respiratory infection. Lots of other colorful names. They call this the crud and things like that. This is a very slow respiratory infection that's chronic. And it can be seen in many of the avian species. Chickens, turkeys, quail. In fact, many times turkeys that have MG have much more prominent symptoms and lesions than we see in chickens, but it can affect many avian species. Wild bird species can carry this, such as the house finches. That's been documented. Large numbers of birds in a flock can become infected, but many times very few of them will show signs. In fact, they seem to be carriers of it. Mortality is usually very low if this disease is uncomplicated. When it is complicated by secondary infections such as E. coli, it can be much higher. Birds become infected by inhalation of the bacteria or by oral contamination or by eye contamination. And what happens is infected birds will shed the bacteria in the exudates. One of the common exudates that's seen is a nasal exudate and an excessive tearing, and also by egg transmission. Incubation period is about a week, maybe a little longer, up to 10 days. Young birds usually are much more severely affected than adults, but the organism, fortunately, is short-lived outside of the host. It can exist out in the environment for only hours to days, depending on the conditions in the environment. Carrier birds, it's been shown, tend to shed the organism when they're stressed. And the bacteria can be carried on multiple items, such as your clothing. It's one of the reasons for having biosecurity. Signs, many birds have no signs. In fact, they're carriers. This is how many of the small flock owners get this into their flock. They will buy a chicken, it's not showing any signs, they'll bring it in, and then all their birds start showing signs of it. Maybe they might have a slight cough. Usually there's some degree of performance issue. They're very poor in performance, such as slow growth, weight gain, not as quite a good egg production, not going to want to eat. Lesions, when we have the lesions, we see a swollen face and sinuses, and this can be quite dramatic in these birds. They can be stunted, we can have leg problems, we can have poor feathering, may see some exudate on the heart and the liver, especially when we have E. coli. Such example in here, this is the heart that's covered in this tenacious exudate here that looks like it's basically white or light yellow in color. May have an inflammation of the respiratory tissues, such as the air sacs, as we see in this slide here. There's a little foaminess in there. We may see a thick mucus in the sinuses. It can also infect the oviduct and the tendons. Now, this is the organism when it's isolated. It has that fried egg appearance. Diagnosis. Many times you can get a pretty good idea of this one by looking at the bird, and if you see some of these signs or some of these lesions, that may be there. It does take specialized medias to isolate this bacteria. We do have blood tests or serologic tests such as the ELISA test, which is the enzyme-linked immunosorbence assay, and then a agglutination test, and then the hemagglutination inhibition test. One of the best tests are the PCR tests, the polymerase chain reaction test. This is where we have probes against the DNA of the organism. We do have to differentiate this from other diseases such as coryza and MS. Treatment, one of the problems with this one is carriers. And what has been shown pretty much in a lot of birds is that they may always be a carrier. Now, antibiotics can help relieve some of the symptoms. We see with this some of the signs such as the runny nose and things like that. But again, you have a bird that has become a carrier. May give them some degree of comfort, which will help in the treatment, such as reducing the stress, keeping the dust down, keeping down secondary bacterial infections. Prevention, basically, we test birds, and if they're positive, they are destroyed. This is a reportable disease in the state of Arkansas, and birds are placed under, the premises is placed under quarantine, and you're strongly encouraged to destroy those birds. Best way to prevent it is by biosecurity, then what the term we call all in, all out, and that's used in the commercial industry where all the baby chicks are brought in at one time, they're grown up to market, and they all go out at the same time. No other flocks on the premises, monitoring, and then being part of the NPIP program. There are vaccines that can be used for this, but many states highly regulate those vaccines. For example, Arkansas, you cannot vaccinate for MG. Here's some backyard hobby flock birds showing some of the symptoms. You can see here we've got a swollen eye, has a little crust on it. Here you can see there's a lot more exudate present around edges of the beak here and on the feathers on the head. Here we have that swollen eye. Here depicts a hen with the baby chicks. No signs whatsoever. This would naturally be a carrier. This is one that is very common. You can see there's a little bit of discoloration here on the beak from the nasal exudate, and you can see this little mucus foamy material here at the eye. In fact, one of the easiest ways that I've found to check for this in a bird that you suspect, if you'll put a little bit of pressure right here, you'll either get a little bit of that slimy foam come up here on the surface of the eye or out of the nostril. Another mycoplasma, Mycoplasma synovii, commonly referred to as MS, can be very, very similar to MG. In fact, mortality, we can have high morbidity, meaning lots of birds sick. Low mortality can be very variable there. Can also be complicated with secondary bacterial infections, such as we have an infection of E. coli in there. Transmitted similar to MG, it's egg transmitted, it's respiratory through droplets and fomites. The spread can be very, very slow in the flock, or it can be out there and fairly rapid. Incubation period is a little longer, usually 2 to 3 weeks. As with MG, the organism does not survive well outside the bird. It can live for hours to days depending on the conditions. And this disease is also complicated by stress and other infections. Some of the signs, again with a carrier bird, no signs whatsoever. You'll have birds with a slight cough. They can be unthrifty, may have some lameness there, which is variable. Some birds that are severely lame, birds that are not very lame at all. Of course, we can have a bird sitting around with a ruffle feathers. What we refer to as that ADR, the ain't doing right bird. When it's in the foot and the leg, we can have some swelling of the foot pad and the hock, as we see in this bird here. There's a lot of swelling here in the hock joint and in the foot pad. Those are some lesions that are seen. The lesions in these joints, around these tendon sheaths, you're going to have the exudate, which is a coloration of very thick grayish to slight yellowish color. May have a swollen liver, swollen spleen, swollen kidney. Can also get that inflammation of the air sac, which we refer to as air saculitis. Maybe some exudate there. Usually it's more mucoid, but it can be cheesy if it's been there for any length of time. And then a green discoloration of the liver. Very, very similar signs to what we see with MG and lesions. Diagnosis, again, signs and lesions, isolation of the organism using specialized medias, other tests, serologic tests such as the ELISA, and then the PCR test. Here you can see we've got an air saculitis, some thickening there and some exudate. Treatment, very similar to MG. Antibiotics will help relieve some of the symptoms, but we have the carrier status. That's one of the problems with it. Prevention, good old biosecurity, all in and all out production. Test and destroy those birds that are positive. If you're in the commercial industry, you don't want to have any home flock whatsoever. With your home flocks, once you have a flock set up, you have to be very, very careful about bringing in other birds. You want to make sure that you isolate them for at least 30 days and at least 100 feet from your other flock, and then prevent wild bird exposure. Vaccinations, we don't really do any vaccinations in the U.S. They are experimental. There are vaccines available and have to be brought in by special permit. Other salmonellas. In addition to the first two salmonella, for pylorium and gallinarum, there are some other salmonella infections. We commonly refer to the group as paratyphoid. These are non-host adapted salmonella species, and then there's a couple that are pretty much in there. Variable by the region. We see Salmonella typhimurium, which is a very common bacteria, salmonella bacteria, in mice, hence the term scientific name murium. We have Salmonella enterica, such as Enteritidis, Arizona, Kentucky, Heidelberg, and some of the others. Now, Salmonella enterica enteritis, commonly referred to as SE, is part of the NPIP program, and it was put in there in about 1988, early out 1989. And then we have Salmonella enterica Arizona. These are both egg transmitted. As with pullorum and typhoid, these Salmonella infect the hen, infect the ovary, and then are passed out in the eggs. Now, it's not that every egg is contaminated with this bacteria, but a fairly large percentage can be. Many of the other Salmonellas can be transmitted via the egg, but this is by eggshell contamination, maybe slight penetration into the egg. It's not basically in the ovary itself of the hen. And then we have horizontal transmission from bird to bird. What are the signs of it? Well, again, very similar to what we see with the Salmonella group. There may not be any signs. You can have a carrier bird. May have a little slight depression, diarrhea, dehydration. Chicks can be weak and there can be poor growth. Lesions, inflammation of the intestines, that enteritis. In baby chicks, the yolk is not absorbed. We can have a septicemia, which is all over the bird. There may be no lesions whatsoever. Very similar. If we have one with no signs, we may not have any lesions at all. One of the common ones is an enlargement of the liver and the spleen, and then cecal cores. Diagnosis, isolation, and identification of the Salmonella. Treatment, in these, antibiotics are not recommended because of the potential, as it is with the others, for developing resistance. Control, again, very similar to what we see for all the others. Sanitation, good biosecurity. There are vaccines that we can use for this one that are commonly used in the industry. Rodent and vermin control, and then management of the feed. One of the reasons why feeds are pelletized. Now, the next two additions to the NPIP program. We've already had the first two diseases, pullorum and typhoid, which got the program started. Added in the mycoplasmas, and then some of the other Salmonella, the SE. Now, two additions on these. One of these is a disease, and the other basically is a protocol. So what was the disease? Highly pathogenic avian influenza was added to the NPIP program. The NPIP program has been very, very successful in the control of pullorum and typhoid. That's why we consider them as historical diseases. Highly pathogenic avian influenza and all the aspects was put underneath that, even though avian influenza is not an egg-transmitted disease or hatchery disseminated, which was one of the main reasons that the NPIP program was started. Highly pathogenic avian influenza is one of those diseases that we consider a foreign disease. We don't want it in this country. But avian influenza we do see in the wild bird population. That's the reservoir, the wild aquatic birds, such as the shorebirds or the waterfowl. They can have many of the influenza viruses in them, different types, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. On the influenza virus, we have what's called hemagglutinin and then neuraminidase, and there are different ones of these. The main two that we worry about primarily are the H5s and the H7s. In the avian influenza, we can have two different scenarios with it. We can have what's called low-path avian influenza, which is the LPAI, which is mildly pathogenic. Many times birds have no signs at all, maybe a little depression, little huddling, little ruffling of the feathers, little decreased egg production and activity, and then we have decreased food and water intake. Maybe some respiratory signs, very, very mild cough or sneeze, and they may have some rattle, and an increase in the lacrimation, which is tearing. Then there's the highly pathogenic avian influenza, what we refer to as HPAI. Now, in the avian reservoir, most of the times we have the low path in those birds. It will be, if there's any pathogenicity at all, and it seems to be that we have more of an enteric infection in the waterfowl. But with highly pathogenic avian influenza, the HPAI, it's a very highly contagious, virulent respiratory disease. Now, influenza is the orthomyxovirus type A. The two subtypes that we worry about are the H5s and the H7s. Now, with the low path, again, the reservoir, it's out there, it's in the migratory waterfowl. It has been shown that the low path avian influenza can and does mutate into high path avian influenza when it's introduced into poultry and other gallinaceous birds such as turkeys. Potentially this disease is zoonotic. That's with some of the Asian subtypes at this time. Transmission is by direct contact oral secretions through the conjunctiva in the eye, and respiratory secretions. Now, what do we see as far as clinical signs with avian influenza? High mortality, hence the term, highly pathogenic. Sudden death. We usually figure low path, the mortality is about 5%. With high path, it's more 95+%. Birds are not going to want to eat. Change in the water consumption. There's a drop in egg production. They seem to be quiet. We don't see it have as much vocalization in those birds. And there's depression and then respiratory signs. You can see what we refer to as cyanotic comb and wattles. They get very, very dark. We can have some GI signs with it, some nervous signs, and some hemorrhages. Confirmation of it, we take swabs and confirm these for the PCR. Prevention and treatment, we do not treat this one. It is not treatable. Good biosecurity those protocols are for controlling this one. Again, a little bit here on the clinical signs of HPAI, no signs, death prior to the onset of signs, excessive thirst, watery diarrhea. Main thing I'll show you on this one is just some of what the birds look like. Here you can see lots of birds are down. This bird here obviously doesn't feel very good. Neurological signs here. I put this disease in there. This disease is not part of the NPIP program at this time. I put this disease in because it's very, very similar as far as clinical signs and lesions to what we see with avian influenza. In fact, only recently did they get the outbreak of Newcastle disease, virulent Newcastle disease, in California under control. So what do we see with this one? Well, with what we refer to as VND, virulent Newcastle, clinical signs, sudden death, high mortality, depression, lack of appetite, respiratory signs, gastrointestinal signs, nervous signs, and hemorrhages. Very, very similar to what we see with avian influenza. This one is a paramyxovirus. It is a different virus. This one is also zoonotic. Typically, it causes a conjunctivitis. And we see what we refer to as 4 manifestations. The exotic or virulent, we see neurotropic, mesogenic, and lentogenic. Lentogenic is a very mild disease. Don't see much. In fact, these strains have been used for development of the vaccines. Mesogenic, we can see the nervous signs and mortality with it. Neurotropic, neurological signs, respiratory signs, and then the highly virulent. Now, this virus can survive for long periods of time out in the environment when we have ambient temperatures. It can be in the feces, it can be in dust. It can live out there for months. It is susceptible to ultraviolet radiation and to disinfectants. Again, the signs, very similar signs to what we see with avian influenza. Diagnostics, again, doing that PCR, and then possibly some Newcastle disease serology, monitoring out there. Prevention and treatment, no treatment, good biosecurity is the best way to bring it under control and to protect it out there. Reservoir, well, wild parrots may have this virus in them. We can see this in a lot of the game fowl, what we refer to now as backyard exhibition poultry. And there is a strain of this in pigeons. Clinical signs, abnormal eggs. You can see here there's a change in the shell of the eggs. They're more wrinkled, change in the coloration. Diarrhea is seen here like in this bird. Here's some of the other lesions. And I've put up a couple here so you can see them. Avian influenza, you got this cyanosis of the comb and the wattles. Right here in this picture, you can see it. Here's a normal bird. This one's got that discoloration. Exotic Newcastle disease, you can see that these birds just don't want to move around. They just don't feel good. Here, sitting around, eyes closed, things like that, might make you think of something like mycoplasma. Avian influenza causes hemorrhages typically underneath the skin. These are on the scales of the leg. Here's a little more severe. Bird just not doing good. This one here, you can see there's an increase in mucoid production in the throat. This photo here is of Steve breeding, and this is by his courtesy. Like I said, it is zoonotic, and you can see here he's got a whopping conjunctivitis from getting that virus in his eye. Biosecurity. This is the protocol that was added to the National Poultry Improvement Plan. And I know biosecurity has already been discussed with you. I put this in there, as I mentioned, the one disease, the latest additions were the one disease, which is the avian influenza, and the protocol, which is biosecurity. Basically, consider biosecurity as you do not go on those farms at all and let unless you have permission to do so. For some more information, you can search out the Extension website for the state of Arkansas. We've got lots of information there on diseases and biosecurity, and there's links to other websites. And here's some here, one called Poultry Tips. We've got some things here on biosecurity practices, some on the diseases, just to give you a little more information about these things. There's a course if you're interested in it. It's called Backyard Poultry. It's an online course that is free. You can take that. In this course, we discuss lots of things on biosecurity, discuss about the anatomy of the birds, discuss the diseases, ventilation, all kinds of information there. And with that, that pretty much concludes my talk. Again, the diseases are pylorium, typhoid, and the mycoplasmas, other salmonellas, avian influenza, and as I mentioned lastly, the program or the protocols that have been put in the National Poultry Improvement Plan are the biosecurity protocols. In fact, there are checklists now that are done through the National Poultry Improvement Plan. Hey, I'm Dr. Dustin Clark, the Extension Poultry Health Veterinarian. This is Charity Barber. She is our youth poultry instructor. We're both with the Cooperative Extension Service of the University of Arkansas Division of Agriculture. We're going to go over the testing procedure to do the rapid whole blood agglutination test for the NPIP program. This will be testing for pylorium and typhoid. So Charity, if you will point out everything.
All right, so we're going to go over the supplies that are needed if you're going to be an NPIP blood tester. You'll need to keep these things with you all the time just to make it easier. A simple cup of water. A lot of people will also use rubbing alcohol, but water handy to rinse your tools in between. All right, this is your blood testing loop. As you can see, it's got the loop on the end for the blood, and then the end that's got the stick where you initiate the stick for drawing the blood. This is an 18 gauge needle and a 3 ml or 3 cc syringe. For this blood test, you're going to have a half cc or a half ml, and that is here on the syringe. Okay, 18 gauge needle, and that's okay for like a large fowl. For a smaller bird, you're probably going to want to try to grab a 20 gauge needle if possible, just because it's a little bit smaller and the stick won't be as big. All right, handy to have rubber gloves, as you can see. And then let's talk about the bands. So a lot of times you'll see exhibitors that prefer a wing band on their chicken, especially the smaller birds. This is a wing band that can be used. Once you close it, it's pretty much permanently there. This is the tool to put that on. Another option, you should always check to make sure that the bird does not already have a band on, a leg band or a wing band with a number on it. If so, that band can be used as your testing reference. This is a leg band that's for larger fowl. All right, so, and the way this works, it's always good to have it bent ahead of time. So especially if you're doing it by yourself. If I can get it off, here we go. So go ahead and, as you can see the numbers right there, fold it, and then depending on leg size on the bird, for a larger bird, you're going to go into that first hole there, and then you can of course tighten it up if the bird is smaller. And then you've got your tool to put the band on the leg. This one is the larger one, so the rivet here is a little bit bigger. That you need to make sure you've got the right size, and then you just clamp it down once it's on the bird's leg. Now, for the smaller birds, you're going to need a separate tool that the size is a little bit different. As you can see, the nipple on the end of that one is a little smaller, and it fits this size band. So again, you're going to fold it. Go ahead and get it like it should be, depending on the bird's leg size, and then you're going to apply it the same way. So, well, it's hard to do with the gloves on. All right, same method, get it in, and then you're gonna clamp down, okay? All right, another option as well for these larger bands, sometimes if you're working with a smaller bird and this is the only thing that you have, so something to do, if you are needing to use the third hole, you can place that and fold it back. So place it in the first hole. Yeah, if I can get it around my finger. and then fold it back on itself and then clamp down. Okay? It's hard to do with the gloves on. Okay. So you've got your tools for the different size bands. Always good to have some paper towels or napkins, and then alcohol wipes or a bottle of alcohol with cotton swabs, with cotton balls. Cotton balls are another thing that you really need to have with you, either the cotton squares or the cotton balls. For when you stick the bird underneath the wing, you're going to have a blood spot there, and then to make that clot, you can have some blood stop powder, pour it on that place where you drew the blood, and then put the cotton ball on top of that. All right, these are the brucellosis test card, or card test. This is where you're going to drop your antigen and your blood and mix on the card. Or you can use the, this is just a hard plastic or glass piece, and you're going to put a test in each square, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and see what size he's going to need. All right. So, and you definitely want to make sure that you're not putting it on tight. It needs to be able to move. Okay, you're going to put it above where his spur is. His spur's right here. You're going to put it above that for him, and you've also got to be able to get the tool underneath. So that's going to be too tight. So you're going to come back and loosen it to the last hole. Okay, and then you'll be able to come with your tool and come over the top. And you want to make sure that you've got it in the rivet area, or the rivet part inside to where it clamps down, and then you need to look after and see if you can pull it off. If you can pull it off, it's not good, so it won't stay. If you've also got a lot of space left, you can also kind of give this a little crimp, and that helps. Okay, it's got to be able to move. For the wing band, you load your band into your tool, and then you're going to find the wing web area. You want to make sure that you're in that thin web part right here. You can pull back some feathers if you need to. This little thin web right here. Just give it a crimp just like that. Okay. And then you'll be able to see your wing band number. The red top tube is something you're going to need if you're submitting your NPIP test to the Livestock and Poultry Commission rather than doing it in the field. So if you don't have antigen, you're not able to do a field test, this is how you're going to collect the blood and put it in a red top tube. This is where you need the half cc or half a mil of blood in order to submit that test. First thing you need to do before you do it is take the wing, write down the wing band or leg band number on the tube, and then make sure you're doing the right bird with what you wrote down. All right, so for me, I prefer to put the legs kind of underneath my arm. You're going to hold the bird down securely. Can you see where I'm at? Okay. So you're going to pull some of those little tiny feathers away. Have your swab ready ahead of time. A little easier. Okay. There we go. You'll have a syringe that you're going to draw the pool of blood from, okay? You're going to put your finger up here at the base of the wing, like at the base of the drumette, and it kind of pops that vein out for you right there. You're going to use your loop and your stick, and you're going to just basically just draw some blood right there. Maybe. If I can get to the vein. There we go. All right, and it's going to cause that, it's going to give you a pool of blood. So you have your blood collecting once you've made your stick, and then you're just going to use your syringe to draw up half a cc of blood. Okay, and then you're going to use your blood stop. You'll pour the blood stop on the wing where that spot is, and then you will then put a cotton ball in there. All right, this is going to go in your red top. You need to do it quickly. Your half cc, and then that's plenty of blood there for the test. You put the lid on it. Now, we've got the pool of blood. If we're doing the test in the field, you'll have, you'll fill your loop up, and then you would have had your antigen on here, and you will just swirl it with the antigen drop, just like so, okay? If you're not using the brucellosis testing card, that does not want to pool in that. You're just using the squares. You would have had your antigen drop on there, and then you will swirl it just like so with your blood droplet. When you've got a bird that's too small, you feel uncomfortable drawing from the vein in the wing, what you're gonna do is you're just gonna toe clip, so you're basically just trimming the toenail just enough to get it to quick. And so what we're gonna do is we're just barely gonna trim. You can always trim more if you need to. So see, I trimmed the very end of it off and it didn't quite get to the quick. So you're gonna trim just a hair bit more. You're not taking off the entire toenail, you're just barely quicking it. Again, not quite enough. You had long toenails. You're a loud one. Okay, and with that kind of reaction, usually you know you got the quick. So you'll see the little blood coming out there at the end. And so this is going to be for the test where you've got the antigen in the square or the antigen in a spot on the brucellosis card test. And then you're going to take that baby chick.
Take your plate.
Or bring it up to him.
Bring it up and put it out.
Okay, and so you'll put the blood drop on first.
There you go.
Okay. You'll get your droplet of blood there, and then you're going to take your NPIP antigen, and you will put your droplet on there, and then you'll use your tool to mix the two, just like we did earlier. You'll just swirl it around just like so. Okay. On the foot, you can put a little bit of the blood stop, or you can put a little piece of paper towel or a little piece of cotton ball, and it'll just clot that up and it'll stop bleeding. It doesn't bleed very long at all.